Good morning and welcome to one last review from November. This is the non-fiction book, The Dinosaur Heresies by Robert Bakker. I know that this review will probably be coming out in December, but I did actually finish this book in November with, I think, a day to spare. It was a mission, I'm not going to lie. There is a lot of this book, and it is jam-packed full of information. So it is not the fastest of reads. Thoroughly enjoyable, but not fast. Okay. Robert Thomas Bakker, whose name I may be mispronouncing, but you know, was born in 1945. He's an American paleontologist, and by the 70s, he was a rising star and a bit of a rebel in his field. With the Dinosaur Heresies and a 1975 Scientific American, I believe, article, he started challenging all the orthodoxies about dinosaurs, which is why this is called the Dinosaur Heresies. Interesting thing about reading this book is that he has so successfully challenged so many heresies on a deep and fundamental level, to the point that if you are a kid or a teenager first getting into dinosaurs in the 2025s, you are going to just take for granted a large portion of the points made in this book which were challenging the old orthodoxies. First of all, let's start with the cover. The cover is great. I'm not entirely sure who painted it, but it could well have been Robert T. Bakker himself, because Bakker did the illustrations throughout, some of which are gorgeous. Now, in the first pages, it tells us they're all drawn by him, and they're based on museum displays and his personal professional career throughout. Many of them are gorgeous drawings like the one I just showed you. Other ones are scientific diagrams such as this one, which is the phalogeny of the dinosaur family tree, with each figure representing a family. It's large, it's elaborate, and it's really quite beautiful. Even though it's functional, you have got an element of beauty and creativity to all the images in here. And there are a lot of them, and they're very, very detailed, some of them. So, I'll show you one particularly beautiful plate from the beginning first. This is from page 21 in my copy, and it is an illustration of one of the first dinosaurs discovered, the 30-foot predator, Megalosaurus, dug up in the 1820s in England, and here he is attacking a sea crocodile. Gorgeous, gorgeous artwork. Any one of these could be hanging on someone's wall, and they probably are. Okay, so this book is a book in five parts, and you've got the preface as well. In part 1, it's called The Conquering Cold Bloods, a Conundrum, and is comprised of 4 chapters: Brontosaurus in the Great Hall at Yale, Wyoming Reverie, Meditation on the Geological Text, Mesozoic Class Warfare, The Cold Bloods versus the Fabulous Furballs, Dinosaurs Score, Where Komodo Dragons Fail. And this takes us up to page 75. So it's a relatively small part of the book. Oops, it takes us past 75. Komodo Dragons Fail up to... There we go. So it's a fairly small part of the book. And basically what this is setting us up to understand what he's trying to do. And, of course, his first point was the dinosaurs can't have been cold-blooded. And this is where he starts to explain why the science, if you look at it with an open mind, indicates that they can't have been. Okay, so on page 27, he's got quite a nice little discussion of orthodoxies and how they work. Okay. And the point, I've got lots and lots of bookmarks in here, as you can see, one less. So his core principle here was be kind to colleagues, ruthless with theories is a good rule. And he talks about, generally speaking, labels or badges are harmful in science. So if a scientist pins one labeled reptile on an extinct species, such as, a dinosaur, everyone who sees it automatically thinks, oh, reptiles today are cold-blooded, slow, rely on the sun, etc., etc. Therefore, the dinosaur that's been labeled a reptile must also be slow, cold-blooded, rely on the sun, etc. Sluggish when the weather is dark, a lower vertebrate, not as good as the mammals. And of course, he's challenging that, and the reasons that he's challenging it are incredibly detailed. On any one page of text like this, you have got so much detail. It is staggering. And that makes it a very, very slow read. This is still a popular science book. You don't have to be a paleontologist, a zoologist, a geologist, or any other kind of ologist, really, to follow what he's saying here. But you will follow it easier because all the theories and the way science works are gone into in beautiful detail. But it can be, it can be a bit information dense. There were a couple of pages that I had to read through, think about it, read again. And there are a lot of theories that I recognized with glee. For example, yes, I love this bit. This is on page 60, so we're still in the first section. And Lacertilian is the standard label for all lizards. Comes directly from the Latin lacerta, the Roman name for the common Mediterranean wall lizard. A hefty 4-pounder that has hunted big insects around human habitations since the Parthenon was built. Anyway, so this section was really, really great. And it starts challenging the notion that the mammals were better adapted in some way than the dinosaurs, based on the fact that the whole notion of them being better is their faster metabolism, their greater adaptability to temperatures changes and habitat changes, and all of that relies on our warm-bloodedness. If the dinosaurs weren't cold-blooded, right there that adaptation is lost. And a really good point that he makes here too is how long they lasted. Dinosaurs lasted for one however long time. And mammals shared the habitat with them for a long time before getting that expansion. Anyway, part 2 is the habitat of the dinosaurs. And this is further evidence to a large extent on the cold-bloodedness, but it starts to creep into some of the other heresies, the orthodoxies that he's challenging with his heresies. So, part 2, the case of the Brontosaurus finding the body, gizzard stones and the Brontosaur menus, the case of the duckbill's hand, dinosaurs at table, when dinosaurs invented flowers. That last one is an interesting one. He's got a theory about how flowering plants, that's angiosperms, evolved as a result of dinosaur habitat changes. Don't know that one's caught on, but many of the other concepts here have. Now, here I will point out that I was that kid in class who got reviled by my schoolmates and talked down to my teacher when they were teaching me that Brontosaurus lived in a swamp. It was so huge and heavy that it needed to rely on the water to pull it. Its dentition was too poor to be able to eat the strong cycads and so forth that were the predominant plants. Say, I am a dinosaur. This is my theropod dinosaur. Are you a dinosaur? Maybe, he says. Do I care? No, seed still arrives when I want it. And totally derailed myself there, didn't I? Okay, yes. So, the Brontosaurus living in the swamp. When I was taught that as a wee tucker of, 10 or 11 or whatever I was, I said, that doesn't make sense. A brontosaur's leg is very, very straight. It ends in a round bit. If that stands on the mubbard of a swamp, it would sink. Ho, 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 what an idiot you are. No, 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 you don't understand. Well, to you, I did understand. And that was one of the heresies which Robert Bakker went for. The idea of the brontosaurs living in swamps apparently evolved largely because a lot of brontosaur fossils were found in areas that were swampy. But, as Bakker makes a very good point, just because you find a fossil somewhere doesn't mean that's where the animal lived. It just means that either where it died, or more importantly, where it fossilized. So brontosaurs could have lived perfectly happily on the dry upper mesa, being washed down in a flood, and then buried in the subsequent sediments, and hence fossilized there. And he makes a good point, not only for brontosaurs, but for many other dinosaurs being fossilized in areas where they hadn't actually lived. What are we doing? Are we chewing the camera? We've had words before about chewing the camera. So that was the start of the Dinosaur heresy. Sorry about me and my bird, my own dinosaur. The other one was the dentition. Now, if an animal isn't alive to watch what it eats, the next best way of finding that out is by studying its teeth, jaw structure, and so on and so forth. And a large part of this particular orthodoxy that they had to eat soft stuff was because they believed their teeth weren't good enough. But one of the things that they weren't take to chew heavier things like cycads. One of the things that they wasn't being taken account for in this theory is the whole notion of gizzards. My little dinosaur back there doesn't have teeth. He's got a beak and he's got some raspy area that he can use to grip and shell seeds very effectively. It's quite impressive. But he doesn't have teeth to chew. What he does is he swallows his food down a fairly rigid, reasonably unglandular gizzard compared to ours, and in his stomach, the stones that he compulsively eats act as a grinder, and they grind up all the food in the stomach to a point where it can be absorbed. Well, dinosaurs did the same thing, and in this second section, the habitat of the dinosaurs, Bakker talks about finding these piles of smooth pebbles, or actually more like rocks and boulders, near various dinosaur fossils. They got ignored for a long time, but basically the case for this is that yes, the dentition wasn't enough to chew cycads, but they didn't need to. They just needed to rip it off and swallow it. And in the gizzard, the stone would create this stone mill and they would macerate it all up. Also in this chapter, there is one of the most metal images I can imagine. It's actually examining skulls. And you can see that if you compare the top with the bottom. But I ask you, if you just saw this one image all on its own with no context, look at that. It belongs on the album of a heavy metal CD. It really does. Awesome stuff. Anyway, so that's the habitat of the dinosaurs, and he starts to talk a little bit too about the sizes of the dinosaurs. Gorgeous image, that one. And the tree, the angiosperms, the flowering trees that grew higher and higher to escape the dinosaurs, which stood higher and higher. And he started to go into their structure as well, that would have allowed some of them to stand on two legs. We've got rather nice little timeline here as well, in order to reach the higher plants that they were eating. Rightio, and that takes us on to part 3, defense, locomotion, and the case for warm-blooded dinosaurs. It's not as segmented as that. In each particular section, he talks a lot about the different things, and they tie into each other. So the case for warm-bloodedness really starts in the original, and when he's talking about the different habitats that they lived in. Vast amount of knowledge. Not just dinosaurs in America, where Bakker primarily has worked in his lifetime, but from all over the world. Gobi Desert dinosaurs. I think there's even a mention of an Australian dinosaur as well. There's mosasaurs, there's old dinosaurs, there's newer dinosaurs, and everything in between. It is fantastic. If you're into dinosaurs and you haven't read this book, you're missing out. Okay, part 3. Defense and locomotion, etc. The Teutonic Diplodocus, a lesson in gait and carriage, Mesozoic arms race, defense without armor. Woohoo! Dinosaurs take to the air, and my personal favorite dinosaur, Archaeopteryx, paternity suit. The dinosaur-bird connection. Because yes, I'm pretty sure that Bakker I don't think that he's the first to have ever noticed certain similarities between bird bones and dinosaur bones, but he really formalizes it here. And the modern interpretation that birds are dinosaurs and are the most modern living dinosaurs, so dinosaurs didn't actually die out, I'm pretty sure it heralds back to Bakker and a few of his colleagues. But the lesson in gait and carriage starts off really, really interesting. Is a very major heresy that he also invoked. So this is just one image that comes to mind easily, but basically speaking, he's looking at the joints and the connections of the joints and how the limbs must have worked to disprove the orthodoxy that dinosaurs stood like this. Now reptiles sort of stand like this, and they, as a consequence, you've got a fairly steady baseline pace. I'm not saying that a frill-necked lizard can't outrun me 50 times faster. It can. A crocodile, a saltwater crocodile, can outrun a horse for the first few meters. Was it 500 meters? After that, of course, the horse wins. They have their speed, but this particular joint mechanism means that it's specific speeds. And so, because the traditional view of dinosaurs was that they were cold-blooded reptiles and they weren't endothermic, they didn't move fast, so of course they were reptiles, so of course they must have stood like that. But when Bakker and several of his colleagues started looking at the joints, it's like clear that no, they did not stand that. They stood like a rhino, not like a Komodo dragon. Not that I think I can outrun a Komodo dragon. I'm going to tell you, those things are terrifying. I've seen one. I've never felt so much like a prey item as when I was being stared at by a Komodo dragon in Indonesia. Seriously intimidating. You should definitely meet one if you ever can, with a wall in between you. Okay, what else have we got? What other notes have I made? Page 232, that's way ahead of where we're at. No minutes now. Yes. Okay, so anything else I particularly need? Okay, the defense without armor and dinosaurs take to the air. They are also quite fascinating parts that I really don't think I can do justice to in describing, and certainly it would take me hours if I tried to. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned so far about Robert Bakker is that his writing is not just erudite, detailed, and dense, but it's fun. He's talking about something he loves, and it is really, really coming through, as do these sly little bits of humor and a sense of someone who is so involved in his own personal interest, career, hobby, all of the above, that he sees it in a way that we never would. Now, I don't know, but a Stegosaurus is about 5 tons. I would not normally think of that as something light and airy. But on page 233, he says, Stegosaurus must have been a grand performer under attack. A 5-ton ballet dancer. With an armor-plated tutu of flipping bony triangles and a swinging war club. How good is that? That's the sort of humour and writing style you can expect throughout. And part of what he's talking about there is the ability, this one is Edmontonia, great image there, is their ability to move fast. The idea of sluggishness is something you could maybe equate with a heavily armoured dinosaur like the Triceratops. It's got those horns, it's got the armour up the front, not armoured throughout like some of the other ones are, but others have got specific armour, and their armour must have come from their locomotion and non-armoured defence tactics. So that's a pretty great element. Oh yes, and we go into dentition. Did you know that dinosaurs had teeth like flowers? I don't think I ever knew that. I mean, I must have known this last time I was reading this book, but yeah, look at all those pretty little crenellations there. Rightio, where are we? We're not getting very fast through this, are we? Archaeopteryx. My beloved Archaeopteryx. I could talk about that one a lot. Let's see if I can find a image of Archaeopteryx at least. Oh, no, this isn't Archaeopteryx, but look, how good is that? How good is that image? Perfect. Would totally hang that one on my wall. Dinosaurs Take to the Air, chapter 13. What point was I trying to make here that I left a bookmark? Oh yes, it starts with a very poetic description of how Pterodactylus came to be fossilized. Flying dragons entered the sphere of human knowledge not as giants, but as tiny winged skeletons from the fine-grained limestone of Bavaria. And it talks about the salty Jurassic Sea that laid down these limestone beds in shallow bottoms behind reefs preserved tiny skeletons with exquisite fidelity, because the hypersalinity discouraged the activity of scavengers. And occasionally a tiny leather-winged form would fall into these briny waters, and 150 million years later, during the 19th century, quarrymen would get them out, raven-sized flying dinosaurs, and send them to the nearby German scholar Baron Cuvier in Paris. Baron Cuvier was a pretty major part of paleontology, and he's mentioned throughout the Dinosaur Heresies quite often. Now, this was published in 1986. Clearly I didn't read it then. I'm pretty sure I read it for my undergraduate, and that was when I first encountered and fell in love with Archaeopteryx, the dinosaur that was first discovered with feathers. And that was a heresy in itself. There was that very first one that came out was talked about a lot, but eventually I think now we have got 3 or 4 Archaeopteryx fossils at least. And here also is a very, very interesting point about, I don't think I can pronounce this thing. So there's this bird in South America, Hoatzin, I think, Hoatzin, and I think it's called a Hoatzin. And what we've got here is we have got a image showing the way the bones are fused in a chick versus an adult. So the Hoatzin chick can climb out of its nest and climb around the tree because of the way its foot isn't fused and having a opposable thumb that allows it to climb in a way that the adults don't. Incidentally, I recently did a buddy read with Ira over on SF Words of Wonder of Lifeboat by Harry Harrison and Gordon Dixon. When they were describing the hand of the alien in that book, it reminded me a lot of this Hoatzin and some other dinosaur fusions around the wrists. That was totally an aside, wasn't it? Okay, the other thing this particular section reminded me of is genetic storage. So the genetic storage is a notion that you've got a genetic code. It's no longer enacted as in Hoatzin adults, but in the chicks it still comes out. And the concept is that any descendant of someone bearing the code will still have that code somewhere, or may have that code somewhere, and it could emerge, which is not so coincidentally the central concept behind one of the other books I read for Dinovember, which was The Enormous Egg. In this gorgeous little children's book by Oliver Butterworth, you have got the code for a dinosaur remaining in their modern inheritors' chickens, and one day materializing and bringing a live dinosaur to life. This was written in 1956. And a theme throughout this book is how many of the orthodoxies actually had become to be orthodoxies despite evidence. So you had people working in the 50s, in the 1800s, who discovered all these things about dinosaurs, which were then ignored around about maybe the 20s and 30s, to have these orthodoxies about the cold-blooded reptilian dinosaurs who weren't any good and were dying out anyway, when the mammals came around. So yes, all of that stuff. Where am I up to? Okay, we are up to part 4, the warm-blooded metronome of evolution. And in this particular section, we have got Sex and Intimidation, the Body Language of Dinosaurs, in which he mentions that early American paleontologists were very reluctant to claim any feature of a dinosaur as having a reproductive basis. They wanted it all to have a practical basis, which led to some very, very odd theories and a few very odd orthodoxies, because as we can see in the animal kingdom around us, a lot of what an animal is about reproduction. Without that, the species dies out. There is no possible useful point of a male peacock's tail except to attract females, and the unwillingness to accept that dinosaurs had similar evolutionary pressures on them meant that some of the orthodoxies were odd. Second part of that is the warm-blooded tempo of the dinosaurs' growth, yet more evidence for warm-bloodedness, how they grow, etc. Strong hearts, stout lungs, and big brains. That was a fascinating bit. That, or earlier, was when I was talking about air exchange in dinosaurs versus birds. It's quite different. I'd better not get into it right now. Okay, eaters and eaten as the test of warm-bloodedness. Did I make any notes about this section? Diplocaulus authored organically. Oh, yes. Did I put down that? Okay. There is a section in here that I found excessively amusing. Once again, an example of the wonderful, fun writing of the author, where he's talking about a particular small animal, Diplocaulus. It was an aquatic animal that probably lived on the bottom of shallow, fairly placid waters. I'm sure I saw an excellent picture of it here somewhere. But basically, he describes it as an organically grown boomerang because of the shape of its head. There we go. There's your organically grown boomerang. Isn't it fantastic? I'd go back in time to watch these guys playing. And that is also one of the examples he was making about a feature that could not really have had any practical application except during mating or sex. Where are we now? Are we heading into... I think we're heading into the fifth section. So the fifth and last section is an oddity. It's called Dynastic Frailty and the Pulses of Animal History, and it starts with punctuated equilibrium, the evolutionary timekeeper. Now, that is an orthodoxy that was challenged by these guys, but also by... Damn. What's the name of the guy who wrote the Burgess Shale? This is embarrassing. I've read it so many times. Anyway, Google the Burgess Shale, the guy who wrote that. So the idea behind evolution is, in an orthodoxy sense, is that it goes from Mesozoic to current in this steady pace. But the theory of punctuated evolution is different. It says there isn't a steady pace. There's a long, stable area where no actual change in speciation happens, where a species is stable and doesn't change. Then you reach this point and you have some punctuated evolution with a whole heap of fast evolution happening, and then another long, smooth stage. Punctuated equilibrium, I don't think that is really a rebel notion anymore. I think it's largely accepted that it can happen. This is one of the examples of something, it doesn't have to be either or. There are clearly elements of punctuated equilibrium, but there are other examples which are less supportive of it. Setting the same stage for Dinosauria, and then we've got the twilight of the dinosaurs and Dinosaurs Have Class. The final chapter, Dinosaurs Have Class, is a lot of fun. It's basically talking about, I just came across the non-dinosaurs. Non-dinosaurs with fast growth bone structure in the Mesozoic, the fish lizards. This image is gorgeous. I'll make one hell of a tattoo, I'm just saying. Yes, so this last section is odd in that Bakker, at least when he wrote this book, after having challenged and quite thoroughly demolished many orthodoxies in a very rebellious sort of way, this part 5 has got a little bit of a sour note for me, because yeah, after all that rebel attitude, he suddenly decides to go all, oh, well, there can't have been a meteorite. It can't have been a meteorite that wiped out dinosaurs. That iridium layer all over the world, well, could come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be what he calls, what does he call it? He terms the dismissive phrase, the theory of the Death Star, for the meteorite hitting the Earth, maybe wiping out the dinosaurs. This is in his second last chapter. And the reason it stands out, and not that I expect him to necessarily agree with theories sight unseen, but this theory that he doesn't agree with is the first one in which he doesn't provide a huge amount of meticulously detailed and very convincing evidence. In this one, he seems every bit as dismissive without evidence or without sources as all the people that he challenges in all his previous chapters. None of that meticulous analysis of detail. It's just all this is dismissiveness. For example, when he's talking about how if the shallow seas ran off, the temperature of the ocean would have rises, and this is a well established. Well established isn't a good enough reason to say that it happened. And after having read some 400 odd pages of him telling us that well established and orthodoxies don't necessarily mean that they're so, that chapter was startling. And I would be a little bit interested, I know he's got at least one of the book, I would be interested to see if he's still of the opinion that dinosaurs were wiped out by disease or migration or any of those other very lackadaisically mentioned things. Okay, another thing that's not mentioned extensively in here is plate tectonics and their effect on migration. And plate tectonics is something that no one that I know questions in any way. It's an established scientific theory. There's so much evidence for it and so little evidence that can't be explained by it. It's largely accepted. And I keep forgetting that it wasn't really accepted in the general scientific community until the 60s. It burst upon the scene in the 50s. In the 60s, it's late 60s, I think even, it started to become established. And by the 70s, it was established, but it was a new theory. And it hadn't actually been written into all the other theories in all the other areas. And that might be why there's no mention of supercontinents. There's no mention of Gondwana, the Eurasia splitting off. Not really much mention of the distinction that you get between the North American continents and the South American continents. All of that really doesn't come into it very much. And I would be interested to see if it does in his more recent book, which I believe was published about 10 years later. Never occurred to me to look for more books by him. I've loved this book so much and I've read it at least 3 or 4 times over the years since undergrad. And yeah, never occurred to me to look for another one. Thank you, Internet. My ever-growing book list. Okay, in the final chapter, Dinosaurs Have Class. We totally redeem ourselves there, really. He talks about the way dinosaurs as a class, as an actual phylogenetic class, come and go. And he talks with some embarrassment about how, as an undergrad, he was once had the position of writing notes for lectures to educators in fields, and at that point the general consensus was that dinosaurs were not one unified class, that the word dinosaur was an artificial label which included 3 completely phylogenetically separate and non-related animals. However, they now have their own class again and they are all allowed to be dinosaurs, and I have to say that gave me a little bit of a laugh. Orthodoxies are orthodoxies, but we who love dinosaurs always knew they were always the one group. Once again, a lovely illustration, really cute and funny, which illustrates that. And right at the top there, which my camera won't focus on, you can see birds. Birds right there. Dinosaurs are not dead. They evolved into people like my little chicken over there, happily demolishing the bookshelf. Okay, I'm going to mention one last thing. Histopathology or histology happens to be the science which has sponsored my life and most of my book buying and travelling over the years. And there's even a mention of histology in chapter, The Warm-Blooded Metronome of Evolution, around page 355, where it's talking about how Haversian canals in the bone can be connected to high metabolism. And he talks quite interestingly about how fossils of dinosaurs bone can be ground down to very, very thin layers, which can then be observed under the microscope. Not too dissimilar, but quite dissimilar, really, to what I was doing just a day or two ago. Anyhow, what I haven't mentioned is that there are plenty of other bits of science. There are plenty of other beautiful little details, like the Latin quote that I mentioned. Anyone who loves dinosaurs and enjoys reading about them and their trek into modern sensibilities and understanding why we believe the things about dinosaurs that we do currently believe should definitely try the Dinosaur Heresies by Robert Bakker. Maybe try it when you've got a lot of time for reading, because while it is an excellent book, it is really, really not a fast read at all. Thank you for watching. If you're still watching, this is a long one. And thank everyone who participated in Dinovember, even if it was only picking up a kid's book, even if it was only going to a museum. Thank you. Read good books.